In the winter fog that rolled across the ridges of Clay County, the sound came first, a kind of low animal moan that seemed to rise from the earth itself. When the sheriff's deputies forced open the door to the Devlin farmhouse in 1991, the air that escaped was heavy, sweet, and rotting. Inside, 7 children stood in silence, pale as candle wax, eyes wide and unblinking. Their skin had the grey cast of those who have not seen sunlight for years. One of the younger girls held a jar of cloudy water, cradling it like a doll. Another boy, maybe 10, had drawn symbols across the walls, concentric circles, intersected with crosses and numbers that had no meaning anyone could recognize. The deputies would later say the house felt wrong, not in the way a crime scene feels wrong, but in the way an abandoned church does. A place where prayer had been replaced by something else. The floorboards were warm under their boots, though there was no fire burning. The smell of iron and decay hung in every room. In the basement, they found what looked like sleeping quarters, 7 narrow bunks, each labeled with a name. Beside them, rows of sealed jars, grains, dried fruit, meat, and in the far corner, an old television that had been gutted and filled with stones. There were no toys, no clocks, no mirrors, only silence, broken by the steady dripping of water somewhere behind the wall. When the children were led outside, their eyes burned and teared in the daylight. None of them spoke until the youngest, a girl of 4, pointed toward the sky and whispered, "It's still blue." That was when the social worker began to cry. No one understood yet what these children had been prepared for, or what they believed they had survived. But those who were there that morning would later swear that as the door closed behind them, the house itself exhaled, as if something ancient and patient had finally been disturbed. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Clay County sits in a hollow of the Appalachian spine, where the mountains fold in on themselves like old hands at prayer. It is a place the map forgot to finish drawing, a landscape of washed-out roads and abandoned mine shafts that swallow sound. Locals will tell you that the winters there never truly end. They just sink deeper into the soil, waiting. By 1991, most of the coal companies had vanished, leaving behind a ghost economy and a generation that measured time not in years, but in collapses. The Devlin Land stretched over 200 acres of ridgeline and hollow, a property inherited rather than bought, passed from father to son like a wound that refused to close. No one went there anymore. The mail carrier stopped trying after the gravel road washed out. The power company disconnected service sometime in the late 80s. To the outside world, the Devlins had become another Appalachian rumor, a family that had gone to ground, hiding from taxes, from government, from God. Old maps list the area as Harlan Settlement, though the name appears in no county record after 1913. There are stories that a church once stood on the hill above the Devlin property, its congregation wiped out by influenza or madness, depending on who tells it. When the social worker, Margaret Hines, first approached the farmhouse that January, she noted the absence of sound, not just birds or wind, but the absence of anything living. Snow lay unbroken across the fields, though the children's bare footprints led from the barn to the house and back again. Dozens of tracks like ritual patterns pressed into the frost. Inside, the walls had been painted black from floor to ceiling, every window sealed, crosses carved into the wood above each doorway, uneven, frantic, as though someone had made them in the dark. In one of the upstairs rooms, Hines found a calendar from 1978 still nailed to the wall. Every date after December 12th was scratched out. There was a book on the kitchen table. The cover read Holy Bible, but the inside was hollowed out and filled with strips of paper, each one inscribed with a single word written in careful, trembling script: fire, breath, silence, neighbors. When questioned, remembered the Devlins as quiet, polite, and private. They drove an old pickup once a month into town for salt, kerosene, and grain. Ruth, the mother, sometimes sold eggs at the feed store, but never lingered. Thomas never spoke unless spoken to. No one saw the children. Some believed they didn't exist at all, until the day the mail piled up, the day the sheriff was called, the day the door broke open and the house began to breathe. And under that house, beneath the packed dirt floor, investigators would later find something that wasn't in any of the official reports. A small wooden hatch leading downward into the dark. The hatch beneath the Devlin farmhouse opened onto a passage no wider than a coffin. The air that escaped was colder than the winter above. The kind of cold that comes from long stillness, from years of breathless waiting. The deputies refused to go down at first. It was Margaret Hines who insisted, lowering herself into the dark with a flashlight trembling in her hand. The tunnel sloped downward, the walls lined with timber beams that had begun to rot. Symbols were carved into them, crude spirals, triangles intersected with circles, marks of protection or containment. The passage ended in a narrow chamber, where the floor had been dug several feet deeper than the rest. In that pit lay the remnants of what appeared to be a makeshift altar, a flat stone stained with something dark and old, surrounded by jars sealed with wax. Some held soil, some hair, some scraps of paper folded into tight squares. On one wall, written in charcoal, were the words, "We go below, so that the sky may live." No official report ever mentioned this room. The sheriff ordered it sealed, claiming it was part of an abandoned root cellar. But those who went down there that night came back different. One deputy resigned the next morning, citing unsettled conscience. Another began drinking heavily and was dead by the following spring. When questioned later, the eldest Devlin child, Samuel, said quietly, "That's where Father spoke to the earth." When asked what he meant, he only smiled and said, he was learning its language before it started to burn. The Devlins had lived on that land since before the county existed. Their ancestors were among the first settlers to arrive from Virginia, men and women who brought with them Bibles, rifles, and the old superstitions they pretended not to believe. Generations of them were buried on the property, though no gravestones marked where. Local folklore claimed the Devlins were earth keepers, people who stayed when everyone else fled the coal collapses and epidemics, guarding something older than the family itself. Thomas Devlin, according to the county archives, was born in 1949, a quiet, gifted student, never in trouble. But those who knew his father remembered a man obsessed with prophecy, a miner who spoke often of the sleeping fire under the mountain and how it would one day devour the sky. Thomas inherited the land when he was 19, and within a decade, he stopped leaving it entirely. By the time Ruth married him, he had already begun digging. Ruth Caldwell Devlin was not from Clay County. She had been born 2 counties east, the daughter of a coal foreman and a Sunday school teacher. There are photographs of her from the 1970s. Hair parted neatly down the middle, eyes fixed just past the camera, as if looking towards something no one else could see. She met Thomas through a church gathering in Harlan, where he spoke to small groups about preparedness and divine warning. Those who attended remembered him as polite but strange. quoting scripture that did not exist in any known Bible. Verses about the children who will walk through fire without burning. Ruth married him that same year. They moved to the Devlin property in the autumn of 1976. The old farmhouse, abandoned since Thomas's father's death, became their sanctuary. The windows were sealed. The church in Harlan received no more tithes from them. Neighbors said Ruth stopped coming into town after the first child was born. Her own family tried to visit once, but left before nightfall, saying that Ruth had become someone they didn't recognize. Their firstborn, Samuel, arrived during a thunderstorm in late 1977. There is no hospital record, only a hand-written birth entry in Thomas's journal. He wrote, "Born under the sign of sound and stone. The first who will remember. Each of the children was born at home, without midwives or doctors. Each was given a biblical name, but no birth certificate. They were taught that to exist in the government's records was to become visible to the watchers. Ruth taught them to speak softly, to move without leaving traces. Thomas instructed them in what he called the end crafts, filtering water through ash, preserving food in salt, navigating by stars. It wasn't abuse, it was purpose. By the mid-1980s, the family had almost vanished from local awareness. The postmaster said Thomas stopped receiving mail. Property taxes went unpaid, but no one enforced collection. The Devlin Land was too remote, too worthless for the county to care. They lived as if the rest of the world had already ended. And yet, through the winter winds, a few neighbors swore they heard voices coming from beneath the ground. Low chanting that carried through the soil, rhythmic and patient, like prayer in another language. Dogs refused to go near the property. Crows gathered on the fence line and did not scatter even when fired upon. When questioned years later, Ruth's cousin said she once received a letter from Ruth, delivered by a stranger who refused to give his name. Inside was a single sheet of paper on which Ruth had written, "The old fire sleeps beneath us. We must keep it dreaming." No one knew what it meant. Not then. By 1983, the Devlin children numbered 5. They moved like echoes of their parents, silent, watchful, obedient. When a traveling census taker came through the county that spring, he marked the Devlin property as vacant, despite seeing smoke from the chimney. He would later tell investigators that something about the house made him turn back before reaching the porch, that he'd felt a pressure in the air like being underwater. The children were never enrolled in school. The Department of Education sent letters that went unanswered. But inside the house, Thomas had created his own curriculum, a system of lessons drawn from scripture, survival manuals, and his father's journals. The children learned to read not through fairy tales or primers, but through military field guides and passages from Revelation. Arithmetic was rationing. Geography was mapping the paths of rivers in case the roads ceased to exist. Each evening, Ruth gathered them for what she called remembrance. The ritual began with prayer, then silence. The children would sit in a circle, eyes closed, as Thomas read aloud from a ledger of his own making. The entries were neither confession nor prophecy, but something between: lists of names, coordinates, warnings. Sometimes he wept as he read. Other times he laughed softly, as if at some private joke between himself and the earth. The older children began to take on the strange calm of their father. Samuel, not yet 10, spoke in complete sentences about the end that already happened but hasn't reached us yet. Leah refused to sleep near windows, saying the sky was untrustworthy. Caleb buried jars of food in the yard without being told to. And then, one morning, The family stopped coming into town altogether. When the sheriff's deputy drove out to the property in late 1984 to check on them, he found the road blocked by a fallen tree and the farmhouse windowless, silent, sealed. From the woods, he heard a child's voice reciting something in perfect unison with another, older voice. From dust to dust, from flame to bone, he left before reaching the house. The official report simply read, no sign of distress. Occupants appear self-sufficient. Around that same time, a series of small earthquakes shook the region. Shallow tremors that cracked foundations and dried up wells. Locals said the ground beneath Clay County had started to breathe. Some blamed old mining tunnels collapsing. Others whispered it was the Devlins digging deeper. Whatever the cause, by 1985, the Devlins were entirely gone from public record. No one saw them again until that January day 6 years later, when the social worker opened the door and the blue-eyed children stepped into the light. In the months following their discovery, the Devlin children were studied, catalogued, and examined like artifacts pulled from another era. Yet none of the experts could agree on what they were seeing. Their language was English, but its cadence was strange. Formal, almost biblical. When shown a photograph of a city skyline, Samuel asked if it was still standing, as though the world outside their valley were a ruin from legend. Each child bore peculiar scars, thin, precise lines along the forearms and legs, not self-inflicted, but deliberate. When questioned, they said the marks were measuring lines, proof of readiness. Ruth had carved them during lessons, telling them the body must be known the way one knows land boundaries. To survive, Samuel explained to his interviewer, you must first chart your own flesh. Psychologists noted how synchronized their behavior was. They moved in patterns, rarely interrupting each other, finishing each other's sentences in a calm, almost rehearsed rhythm. When food was served, they divided it into exact portions without being asked. None of them reacted to loud sounds. None seemed to know how to laugh. The social worker's notes from February 1991 describe a night when she entered their temporary care home to find all 7 children awake. Standing in the living room, eyes fixed on the window. Outside, the moon was red with the reflection of a passing storm. It's closer, Samuel said. When she asked what he meant, he replied, the fire. Father said it would come from the sky, but begin beneath us. Margaret Hines tried to reframe their fears through therapy, through simple reassurances, but the children's certainty was unshakable. Their parents, they said, had prepared them for a moment that had not yet arrived. A cleansing, a burning, the great quiet. They were not afraid of it. They were waiting. Over the next weeks, their statements grew more unnerving. 10-year-old Esther began drawing images of tunnels lined with faces, eyes open, mouths stitched shut. Caleb whispered in his sleep about a door beneath the earth that only opened when the world above was asleep. Miriam, the youngest, spoke rarely, but once told her caretaker that she remembered being born in darkness and that she missed the hum. Investigators returned to the Devlin property that spring, hoping to uncover the source of these memories. They found the house collapsed under the weight of its own decay. The basement flooded with groundwater. The hatch beneath had caved in. When they pumped the water out, they uncovered a second chamber, smaller, more recent. Inside were bones. Not human, they said, but the forensic report never specified what kind. And among those bones, sealed in a rusted tin, was a fragment of paper written in Ruth's hand. The children are nearly ready. The blood remembers its own. The forensic report on the Devlin property was filed, reviewed, and quietly buried in an archive room at the county courthouse. The official conclusion: animal remains consistent with local wildlife. But those who had been there that day, the ones who went down into the pit before it was resealed, told a different story after a few drinks. They said the bones were too large, too symmetrical, that the skulls had teeth like a person's, but no sockets for eyes. By late summer of 1991, the surviving Devlin children had been separated into foster homes. Margaret Hines protested the decision, arguing that splitting them apart would undo whatever fragile stability they'd built. But state law prevailed. Within 6 months, 3 of the placements had failed. The children refused to eat, refused to speak, and in one case, refused to sleep anywhere except beneath the bed, because the roof was too close. Samuel was the only one placed with a long-term family, a retired couple who owned a small farm near Hazard. They described him as polite, intelligent, and unnervingly quiet. He read constantly, though no one could recall ever seeing where he got his books. When asked about his past, he would smile and say, "That was the learning time. This is the waiting time." In the fall of 1993, the couple reported strange disturbances around their property: tools missing, fences collapsed, a constant vibration beneath the ground. They found Samuel outside one night, barefoot in the field, standing over a small hole he had been digging for hours. When they asked what he was doing, he said, "Listening." 2 weeks later, the family dog disappeared. Around the same time, Margaret Hines began receiving letters, unmarked, hand-delivered. Each contained a single sentence written in the same deliberate, almost calligraphic script. It hums again. "They're almost home. The door beneath opens slower than the sky." Forensics confirmed the handwriting matched Samuel Devlin's. But by the time police reached the farm, he was gone. The foster parents' report described the night before he vanished. A noise, like thunder underground, the lights flickering, the smell of sulfur in the air. They found his bed empty but warm, the sheets marked with fine black dust. On the wall above the headboard, someone had drawn a circle intersected by 3 vertical lines, the same symbol carved into the beams beneath the Devlin farmhouse. In the years that followed, scattered sightings of the remaining Devlin children surfaced across 3 states. Always near mining towns, always near reports of tremors or sinkholes. None stayed long. None were found again after 2001. When asked about them years later, Margaret Hines said only this: "I think the Devlins were right about one thing. The earth isn't dead, it dreams, and someone has to keep it dreaming." In 2004, a minor landslide exposed part of the old mining network that stretched beneath Clay County, a labyrinth of shafts dating back to the early 1900s. When surveyors entered, they found evidence of more recent excavation hand tools, rope ladders, and wooden support beams cut from trees that hadn't grown in the area for decades. One of the chambers contained a crude mural painted in ochre and soot. It depicted a row of figures standing around a dark, circular pit. Above them loomed a great shape, something like a sun, but inverted, its rays curling downward into the earth. Beneath the figures were lines of text, written in English and something older, a language no one could identify. The English portion read, "We hold it closed by knowing its name." The mural was documented, photographed, and then quietly sealed behind concrete. The official report labeled it a cultural graffiti, but rumors spread that one of the surveyors never came out. The others claimed he wandered off when their lamps flickered, that they heard him speaking to someone in the dark, answering in a low, rhythmic tone, That winter, tremors returned to the region, small at first, then stronger. Residents reported hearing what sounded like whispering beneath their floors at night. One farmer claimed he saw a child standing at the edge of his field, barefoot, staring into a freshly formed sinkhole. When he called out, the figure vanished, leaving only a faint warmth in the soil where it had stood. Margaret Hines, now retired and living alone, received another letter that spring. The envelope was damp, the handwriting unmistakable. Inside were 4 words: "The dreaming is thinning." She took it to the sheriff's office, but by the time they opened it, the ink had run, as though it had dissolved into the paper itself. The sheriff told her to forget it. In August 2005, a gas explosion was reported near the old Devlin property. Though the fire department noted no signs of gas lines, no ignition source, and no smell of fuel, what they did find was a crater 10 feet wide and 6 feet deep. The soil fused into glass. The surrounding trees were untouched. Geologists called it lightning glass. Locals said it was something else. In her final interview before her death in 2007, Margaret said, "If you ever find a place where the ground hums, even just faintly, leave. Don't wait to see what it's dreaming of." The Devlin property remains unmarked today. The land records show it as uninhabitable. But sometimes, when the ground freezes deep enough in winter, and the wind moves just right through the hollows, the soil gives off a sound, low, slow, steady, like something breathing far below. And those who live nearest to it say that if you listen long enough, you can almost make out words. In the winter of 2021, a graduate research team from the University of Kentucky came to Clay County to document forgotten coal era infrastructure. Their goal was mundane digital mapping, drone footage, environmental sampling. None of them had ever heard of the Devlin family. The group, 5 students and 1 supervising geologist, Dr. Karen Mallory, rented a cabin less than 3 miles from the old Devlin property. On their 3rd day, they discovered that their ground-penetrating radar was picking up rhythmic interference, as though something beneath the earth was pulsing every 12.4 seconds. The readings came from an area officially marked as abandoned mineworks, though the maps showed no tunnels there. At first, they assumed it was an equipment fault. Then the vibrations began. Dr. Mallory noted in her field journal, soil resonance increasing nightly. Sounds like deep machinery, but cleaner. Constant, predictable. Feels intentional. One student, Mark Dalton, set up audio recording equipment over the site. When he played back the first night's capture, the sound was faint but structured. Not random seismic noise, but something closer to a breath, a slow intake, a pause, a long exhale. When the audio was filtered through spectrum analysis, a pattern appeared, peaks forming 3 descending tones, almost a voice. They didn't know that same pattern, 3 low tones descending, had been noted 30 years earlier in the social workers' tapes of the Devlin children. On the 4th night, Mark dreamt of a boy standing barefoot in a field, whispering, "It's almost time to wake it." By the end of the week, 2 students had left, citing nausea and panic attacks. Dr. Mallory insisted on continuing, driven by something she couldn't explain. Her notes became erratic. Found wooden lattice under clay, handmade. Burnt at ends. Smell of iron in air after sunset. Soil temperature rises with each breath. On the 6th night, the equipment went dead. The cabin's lights flickered. A red glow pulsed through the fog above the valley. Faint, but unmistakable. Mallory recorded her final voice note at 2:13 a.m. The hum is no longer below. It's in the air. If this is what the Devlins were keeping asleep, it's dreaming with its eyes open now. The next morning, the cabin was empty. The vehicles remained. The equipment was gone. 2 days later, emergency crews found the site cratered, just like the one in 2005. The soil vitrified, the air tasting faintly of copper and ozone. The university classified the incident as a natural methane ignition. The report was sealed. But on local radio, a miner from nearby Big Creek called in, his voice shaking. He said he'd seen children walking along the ridgeline that night, hand in hand, faces pale in the glow. The journalist's name was Evelyn Ward. She arrived in Clay County in October 2025, chasing a rumor, not about the Devlins themselves, but about the hum. Her podcast specialized in Appalachian folklore, forgotten disappearances, the kind of stories that cling to old towns like mildew. She expected ghosts and exaggerations. She didn't expect evidence. At the county archive, the clerk handed her a mislabeled box meningi PRMITs, 1979-1982. Inside were the Devlin files, newspaper clippings, transcripts, photographs. One was of the altar beneath the farmhouse, grainy, flash, lit. But in the corner of the frame, barely visible, a small figure stood watching a child, hair cropped short, eyes reflecting light like an animal's. The back of the photo read, in blue ink, Samuel. Still listening. That night, Evelyn rented a room in town. The hum began just after midnight. It was faint at first, like a generator far away, then stronger, not through the walls, but through her bones. When she pressed her ear to the floorboards, she could hear rhythm in it, 3 tones, descending. She thought of the field notes, the old recordings. When she returned to the Devlin property the next morning, the air was unnaturally still. The trees leaned inward, as though bowing. The ground beneath her boots felt warm. She found the crater, the most recent one, from 2021, now ringed with weeds that shouldn't have been growing that time of year. In the center of the pit lay a piece of warped metal, a recorder. She pressed play. At first, only static. Then a voice, a man's, older, rasped by distance. Still dreaming, it said. Still waiting. Then another voice, clearer, a child's. The earth remembers who kept it safe. Will it wake? Only if we forget. Evelyn dropped the recorder. The hum had returned, louder, closer. The soil trembled under her. She saw movement along the tree line. Shapes. 7 of them, small and still, watching. When lightning split the sky, they were gone. In her final recording. Later recovered from her car, Evelyn's voice is calm, steady. I think the Devlins weren't guarding something evil. They were guarding us. They weren't cultists, they were caretakers. And now no one's left to keep it dreaming. That recording ends at 2:46 a.m., mid-sentence, with a low, rising tone, not descending this time. The following morning, her car was found abandoned on the old mining road. The engine was cold. The ground beneath it was glass. In the months that followed, small tremors spread outward from Clay County, Tennessee, Virginia, West Virginia. Scientists blamed fracking, plate shifts, anything but intention. But those who live near the ridgelines know better. When the wind is still and the frost is deep, they hear it underfoot, the hum growing slower, heavier, more tired, as though the dream itself is fading. And in the pauses between each breath of the earth, there's the faintest whisper, not pleading, not warning, but remembering, we kept it sleeping as long as we could. No, it's your turn. E&D.